Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Australian Chinese Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. I'm Professor Jing Han, the director of this institute. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Darug people of the Darug Nation and acknowledge their ancestors who have been the traditional owners of their land for thousands of years, and pay our respect to First Nations elders, past, present, and emerging. Welcome to the grand opening of this grand exhibition called History Reimagined, Shen Jiawei and NC Qing. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of our distinguished guests, including Kevin Hopgood Brown, AM, the chair of RAC, this Institute Management Advisory Committee, and the committee members, Ariel Zhang. And I want to thank particularly Ariel, we have been very fortunate to have Ariel, who helped us to get the sponsor from TWT for the Australian wine you're going to enjoy. And Professor Jocelyn Che, maybe she's running a bit late, the founding director of IAC and also the chair of IAC Che Fellowship. Dr. Angela Lehman, the chair of the Foundation for Australian Studies in China, FASIC, Stephanie Lowe and Shirley Gall, the CEO and executive director of FASIC. In Tao, the curator of Chinese art in New South Wales Art Gallery, and Dola Merrily, the director of Western Sydney Creative at Western Sydney University, and our speakers of honor, Dr. Louisa Guest and James Bradley. And also we have many renowned artists here today, including Dr. Tianli Zhu, Owen Liang, and Wang Lan, of course, and Dr. Fan Dongwang, Nelson Li, and many of them actually have exhibited with us. And of course, Shen Jiawei and Nancy, and their families and friends. And everyone who's here, thank you so much for your support to the art and to artists. Today's opening ceremony will be a little bit different because we're going to show you two films. One of them is a film trailer. And then we'll have two guest speakers introducing the artists, and we'll have a candid Q&A with Shen Jiawei and Nancy called You Can't Ask That. So in 2023, Nancy gave a live performance of wearing the full set of her glass armor, which you saw in the exhibition. And that was for the first time at her group exhibition, Inner Edge Drifting at Art Space on the concourse in Chatswood. The performance led to her 2024 collaboration with the director Will Swan to film her glass armor performance. The film debuted at her dual exhibition From Fire at the Casula Powerhouse in 2023 to 2024. I don't want to say too much about the film. I just want you now to enjoy this amazing film. I just feel so touched. It's really physical, but also symbolic. And the armor was inspired by Nancy's interest in Chinese historical novel, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, those legendary heroes. And so you can read in so many ways. One of the viewers came and watched it and throughout, and then he asked me, is this a way of torture? I said, well, you can read that way. So you can read so many ways. It's just so beautiful, Nancy. Thank you so much. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Louise Guest. Dr. Louise Guest is an independent writer, researcher, and curator. Her writing about Chinese contemporary art has been widely published. Her first book, Half the Sky, Conversations with the Women Artists in China, was published in 2016. She curated an exhibition of artists featured in the book in Beijing and Hong Kong in that same year. And in 2023, she curated Tao Aiming's first solo art exhibition in Australia at Vermilion. She's now working on a new book examining Chinese artists whose work challenges masculinist traditions of ink painting. Dr. Guest teaches Masters of Curating and Cultural Leadership at University of New South Wales, and her research interests including aspects of gender and national identity in art from Greater China and influence of Buddhism and Taoist thought on the work of contemporary art and artists. Now, please welcome Dr. Louise Guest to give an opening speech.
Thank you very much. And wow, wasn't that extraordinary? Congratulations, NC. Quite amazing. Before I begin, I too would like to acknowledge the Darug people, the traditional owners of the unceded lands on which this university stands, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to their emerging leaders. And thank you, Professor Jing Han, for inviting me to speak about NC Chin's work in History Reimagined. And now that you've seen the video of her performance piece, I'm sure you have some idea of the level of sheer endurance that it requires, and also of the material demands of her practice as a sculptor working with cast glass. And perhaps I think that's even more demanding a technique than the blown glass that we are often more familiar with. Her body of work, a major project of which we see here today, challenges traditional conventions of the division between fine art and craft, a division that has so often in the past relegated the work of women and traditions of the handmade and the practices of cultural traditions to a lesser status than painting and sculpture in historical terms, at least. And it's really interesting, I think, to see young women artists like NC continuing to challenge some of those conventions. The processes of working with cast glass are incredibly time-consuming, physically challenging, and technically demanding, requiring extraordinary skill and knowledge. And as I discovered when I visited her studio and saw this work in production, an amazing amount of patience and a willingness to redo things when things go wrong, as of course they do so often. So she's using the ancient lost wax technique that involves multiple steps. And I'm sure she'll correct me when she speaks if I get this wrong, because it's so complicated that I found it difficult to get my head around it. So the object is made in clay, then molds are created from it using silicone and plaster. Wax is poured into that mold, and then another plaster or silica mold created before the wax is melted out, leaving a cavity into which the glass, I'm looking at NC thinking that's sort of right, I hope, into which glass chunks can flow when the temperature is high enough to melt the glass. It's so complex and it's fired at such high temperatures for a really long period of time. So much can go wrong at any time in even making the simplest form, much less the pieces of the armour which had to be created to fit her body and then to be worn in performance, as we just saw in the video. So I had been interested in NC's practice for a long time, and we'd had a few conversations and a studio visit prior to her solo show at Simon Chan's Art Atrium Gallery. And then we had more conversations in the lead up to a group exhibition of what we might, perhaps controversially, call Asian Australian artists that I curated with Jennifer Young at 16 Albemarle Project Space late last year. And I included 2 of NC's glass installations in that, including her incredibly beautiful Moon Windows, Moon Gates series. So apart from the materiality of working with such a demanding material, the thing, I guess, that most interested me about her work was its underpinning in Chinese cultural traditions, but with a twist, coming from the perspective of someone born in Australia to Chinese parents, a third culture kid, if you like, although I know that's not her preferred identity label. It's so interesting in this exhibition to see NC's work and its approach to history and culture juxtaposed with that of Shen Jiawei, whose lived experience encompassed some of the most difficult periods of modern Chinese history prior to his arrival in Australia in 1989. I think both artists challenge us to think anew about history and to question our assumptions and our conventional wisdom. And I also think that both artists point to our essential humanity in all its difficulty and complexity, and to human connection in their very different ways. In fact, themes of connection and disconnection underpin NC Chin's work. Growing up in suburban Sydney in the 1990s, and let's not forget that this was the time of the rise of Pauline Hanson and One Nation, she felt disconnected from the culture of her parents. She describes her generation as grasping for the culture of their ancestors, but finding only a superficial sense of connection. So today she's working with that medium of glass and all its contradictions and paradoxes that kind of mirror those contradictions and paradoxes of creating an identity, a transcultural identity. So glass is both strong and fragile. It appears precious, yet in fact cast glass is a recycled waste material. It's incredibly heavy, as we just saw, yet it also appears light and translucent. It's a kind of yin-yang material, we might say. So Chin applies these contradictory qualities to reflect on her ancestral Chinese culture from the distance of this southern hemisphere. And much of her work to date represents that struggle to connect with her Chinese family history. She describes her sense of cultural and linguistic dislocation as like living in an intersection of being neither this nor that. And her work with cast glass mirrors that paradox of growing up feeling not quite Australian and not quite Chinese, something else perhaps. At once strong and fragile, glass is beautiful, but also dangerous. In Chin's skilled hands, it shifts from opacity to transparency, as we saw with that beautiful lighting in the video, and it signifies, I think, the uncertainties of the diasporic experience. So in an effort to strengthen her connection to China, she very bravely, I think, spent the year after she graduated high school studying in Beijing at the Central Academy of Fine Arts. And many of you here will know exactly how competitive and academically rigorous CAFA is. And I know that the young NC felt rather alien there, albeit in the land of her ancestors. And she struggled with the constant judgments and comparisons and rankings of the students. One of the biggest challenges, she said to me, was coping with the blow to her pride after being a very high achiever in her education here. And this idea of how notions of pride are represented in Chinese mythologies and in cultural traditions has taken shape in this project of the glass armour. I think her commitment to studying in Beijing took great courage for an 18-year-old girl from Sydney, and I think we see that courage again in her commitment to this very, very challenging practice that she has developed. So glass armour, I think, is really a poetic metaphor about the impossibility of shielding ourselves from heartbreak. Armour is worn into battle to protect soft human flesh from injury. So the concept of armour made from glass is absurd, prompting images of what happens when it's shattered and how sharp shards of glass would pierce the fragile skin. We have, or I have at least, an almost visceral reaction to that imagining. But as NC has told us, the work is also about hubris and ego. She based the armor on myths and histories from the Chinese 14th century classic Romance of the Three Kingdoms to demonstrate values that have traditionally been venerated in Chinese culture. So on the armor, you see reliefs of two famous Shu Han generals, Zhang Fei and Guan Yu, and they're represented on the breastplate and the backplate. In Chinese culture, their figures remembered for their loyalty to their vassal lord, Liu Bei, and their figures are often seen at the entrance of temples as guardian gods. But NC says, to the average mainland Chinese person, these characters are symbolic of loyalty, fealty, and strength. My purpose for bringing in these two iconic Chinese characters is far removed from that. To me, they represent pride and wrath due to their fatal flaws. So rather than focusing on their life at the apex of their power, I was drawn to the events that eventually lead to their downfall, the part of their stories that people often glide over. So as I'm sure you know, Guan Yu's arrogance led to his downfall and the desertion of his soldiers, and Zhang Fei's army mutinied against him. An imagery of their catastrophic downfall is inscribed on the backplate of the armor, symbolizing that duality of pride and shame, and also symbolizing the almost unbearable weight of culture and of familial expectations on a young woman of the Chinese diaspora, such as NC. As you've seen, the weight of that armor, almost 100 kilos, is literally impossible to bear for long. And the performance is a physical and mental challenge for the artist and the audience, I might say too. And so I want to finish with a quote from the artist that I think tells us so much. She says, "The glass's translucency makes it appear light and airy, but just like culture, which is implicit and pervasive, its presence is felt. Just like culture, glass is enduring. Left untouched, it could last millennia, outliving generations. Physically, it's a suit of glass armor that burdens me. Symbolically, it's the rich, beautiful, yet also precarious historical and cultural heritage that burdens me." Thank you, and congratulations, NC.
Such a wonderful speech. I can't speak for Nancy, but I felt like if I were Nancy, I would be so happy that no one else has made such a good speech about Nancy's art. It's really wonderful. It's great. Thank you so much, Louise. Our next speaker of honor is James Bradley. James is a renowned Australian filmmaker. He has just completed his first feature documentary as a director, Welcome to Babel, about the life and the work of Shen Jiawei and his wife and a fellow artist, Wang Lan, whose exhibition was held here last year. It is a film 12 years in the making, based around Shen Jiawei's monumental painting, Tower of Babel, which you saw. And then also you will understand why we have such honor and privilege to have James as a speaker of honor. James has worked in film and TV industry for over 40 years as a writer, producer, director, and editor, telling powerful stories. He co-directed 50 Years of Silence, which won the AFI Best Documentary Award, and produced and directed the multi-award-winning Ochre and Ink, the story of another Chinese-Australian artist, Zhou Xiaoping, and his many years of a collaboration with indigenous artists. James has taught film production and editing at a Metro Screen and University of Western Sydney, before we were Western Sydney University, Australian Film, Television and Radio School, Macquarie University. James also won the 2005 AFI Non-Feature Editing Award for Mr. Patterns. And in 2019, James was given Stanley Hall's Award for Outstanding Contribution to the documentary sector in Australia. The film Welcome to Babel will be premiered in Sydney Film Festival on 8th and 11th of June. Today, we have the privilege of showing the trailer of the film, followed by the speech by James Bradley. Now, please look at the screen.
My whole life is always asking what is truth, and this is why I become a history painter.
沈老师是在中国美术史上非常重要的一个符号。
只要进了那个阿奇堡，人家就会关注你。
但是在生活当中，他 make 了很多那个 bubble。
So this is my last big project called Tower of Babel. I need about 5 years to do that.
Crazy 啊，他这个岁数了，所以我也觉得悠着点干吧。
I is build my new studio. 最被要批判的那一面画是刚刚画出来。
就我们实际上从某种意义上，我们是冒着某种风险在做事情。
所以我接受的教育完全是共产主义的教育，这么一个巨大的社会实验。
因为你是个敌人家的，当时就是说是狗崽子，就是种地。
The bloodbath happened after an afternoon of tension and small skirmishes yesterday.
我在医院里是亲眼看到伤员一车一车送进来。
我当时很绝望，说实在。这个人类，不可救药的就一定想要幻想能够有一个理想的社会。
Вот здесь видно все ошибки человечества.
共产主义是什么意味？
Blood history.
500 years down the track, people will be queuing to look at it in a museum.
我这是为了将来，我也做好准备，就是会有一天，会有些 trouble。但这样准备只要在，就是我这个人就在还活着。
I have to say, I did the subtitles. So please welcome James Bradley to give the speech.
Thank you, Jing, for that introduction and for showing our trailer. I'd also like to acknowledge the Indigenous custodians of the land on which we speak, the Darug people of the Darug Nation. And thanks to Professor Jing Han and the Institute for Australian and Chinese Arts and Culture here at Western Sydney University for inviting me to speak at the opening of this intriguing exhibition. It's a hard act to follow on NC's incredible work there. But I can testify that Jiawei has also suffered for his art over the years. I've seen him climbing the 8-metre scaffold to paint his Tower of Babel, up and down, carrying paintings and so on. And I'm also glad that I heard a couple of laughs in the audience to the trailer, because it's a very serious film, but it also has lots of moments of levity where you are allowed to laugh, and I hope people will laugh. Both Jiawei and his wife Wang Lan have a great sense of humour, and sometimes people laugh about difficulties and stresses because that's the way of dealing with things, but other times life's just plain funny. Anyway, here's a short synopsis of the documentary to give you a bit of a taste of what it's like. This is from a press release. Artist Jiawei Shen has a plan. His wife Lan says it's crazy, but even God can't stop him on his obsessive mission to create a monumental painting about the turbulent history of the international communist movement. Jiawei's 10-year deep dive into the bloody history of revolution is counterpointed by a profoundly close portrait of his complex relationship with his wife Lan, which was forged in the chaos of the Cultural Revolution in China. With over 400 portraits and 100 remixes of iconic artworks, Jiawei finally completes his epic Tower of Babel masterpiece, but faces possible risks in revealing it to the world. In 2012, when Jiawei invited me to make a documentary about his new project, Tower of Babel, neither of us knew that the long road ahead or the challenges we would face along the way. and we didn't know that we would develop a strong bond of friendship that has survived my sometimes strange requests and occasional bossiness as a director. Like, please walk across the square, stand against the wall under the street light, and think about the Cultural Revolution. Or stand at the front of the ferry, look contemplative, and ignore that pesky drone that keeps buzzing around your head. Or turn slowly clockwise in the middle of your studio while the cameraman walks around you in the opposite direction and pretend he isn't there. So, in principle, we were making an observational documentary, but we also needed some more cinematic scenes that help frame the story of Shen Jiawei and Wang Lan's lives. So at times they became actors for the camera, repeating things they often do as part of their normal lives. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes things got lost in translation, and cinematographers can often be very demanding if they've missed focus or the actor has walked in the wrong direction. I remember on our shoot in Beijing in 2015, the cameraman was used to working on big dramatic feature films and was very demanding, to the point that after a long day at the Great Wall, Jiawei was getting a bit annoyed. Late in the day, we were back in Beijing shooting in a famous bookstore. The cameraman missed the shot of Jiawei paying for his huge pile of books that he always buys every time he goes to Beijing. And so I ran downstairs and asked him if he'd come back and do it again. Very rightly, he refused, saying that it wouldn't be real anymore. I felt then that we'd crossed a red line. Later, I asked him if this shoot was like the one he had done with Esmond Storm in 2006 and 2007 for his previous documentary, Goodbye Revolution. Jiawei replied emphatically, "Totally different, totally different." I realized then that we had to adjust our style and be much more aware of staying authentic and not treating this like a drama with actors. Well, not completely anyway. In 2018, my colleague Graham and I travelled to Shanghai with Jiawei for the opening of the exhibition of his famous Standing Guard for Our Great Motherland painting and associated sketches and other supporting material. On that trip, we saw how highly respected he is in China, not just in artistic circles, but much more widely. In his hometown of Jiaxing, we visited his old primary school where he received a hero's welcome and we were both entertained by and mobbed. He was entertained and mobbed by adoring children as he sketched a quick portrait of one of them. We also visited Wuzhen Watertown, where we roamed the narrow alleyways at night when the other tourists had left and filmed some very moody shots in the deserted lanes and public squares. We also stayed a few nights at his good friend Li Bin's house and studio and met many of the old comrades from the Mao Zedong era. It was certainly a trip we will never forget. And there are scenes from that trip, of course, in the completed film. People often ask me why our documentary is titled Welcome to Babel. When my late wife Kathy and I first visited Jiawei and Lan in their old house in Bandina in 2012, we felt the extraordinary warmth of their welcome. And when Jiawei took us into his old studio and explained his plans for his largest and last painting, he welcomed us to the marvelous world of his mind with incredibly detailed information about the history figures and scenarios in his proposed work. And today, with his Babel Tower completed, he continues welcoming people to his studio and enthusiastically explaining all the history figures and their roles in the story of the international communist movement, whether they be visionary philosophers, artists, writers, photographers, doctors, politicians, revolutionary, soldiers, autocrats, peasants, murderers, or their often forgotten victims. He knows them all inside out. It is perhaps ironic that history painting has been mostly replaced by history films, where the people of history are played by actors. Sometimes the resemblance is strong, but often it isn't. However, Jiawei paints every character from a photo or painting. Based on incredibly extensive research of existing images, he paints their true face. And this is a very important aspect of his artistic practice that he explained to us in the very first interview we filmed with him in 2013. He has a vast library and has read many books about modern history and philosophy. And he has a prodigious memory and can relate the biography of every person in his history paintings, including the more than 400 people in his Tower of Babel. This seems like an extraordinary feat of memory to me, but it comes naturally to Jiawei, and it is what allows him to create such powerful and often unexpected compositions of characters in his work. He knows their stories in detail, and he imagines how to link them in his paintings with great skill. The talent he has for creating such astonishing compositions on a vast scale is very rare and precious. Perhaps strangely, sometimes while filming alone for a day with Jiawei, surrounded by all these images in his studio, I felt a great sense of tranquility and peace. The act of watching him paint in silence became almost meditative, and I felt privileged to be a witness to his process and to his great skill. It made me feel relaxed and content, and I'm very grateful for that. Now, as our film launches into the world with 2 almost sold-out screenings at Sydney Film Festival, we have entered a new phase. I hope Jiawei and I will attend many film events together across Australia and perhaps across the world, where he can answer even more questions about his Tower of Babel and its meaning. And I have to thank Wang Lan here also for being such a wonderful host and for participating in the film in a very brave way, actually, and also for cooking so many marvellous lunches every day we filmed at Bundina. It was wonderful. And I have to say, however, that the film ends with a note of sadness. There is a sting in the tail of Jiawei's triumph, and only time will tell how painful or not it will be. Thanks.
Thank you so much, James. Jiawei, I'm sure this is the first time that James is talking about you, in terms of making this a film. So it must be the first time you heard this. Because you can see that, as I mentioned, the film was 12 years in the making. I actually got to know James through Jiawei, because wherever Jiawei was, James was there. So like a twin. So thank you so much. And I can't comment, recommend less for the film. It's a wonderful film, so you must go and see it. And the Wang Lan, it's fabulous. It's amazing. Don't we all have questions we want to ask artists, but we don't think we should or can? Today, we will follow the ABC iView, a reality series called You Can't Ask That style. So we're going to have a very candid Q&A with the artist. To follow the Chinese tradition of respecting the old and protecting the young, 尊老爱幼, we will have Q&A with Shen Jiawei first to give a bit more room to Nancy. So now please welcome Shen Jiawei to the couch. The first question, Shen Laoshi, you have painted so many great portraits of very famous people in Australia and around the world. Are you a rich man now?
Sorry, I use Chinese.
Yeah.
The best
Translating the world is here. Go ahead.
我拥有巴别塔这幅画，所以我是世界上最富有的画家。但是呢，我没有钱，我所有的钱都用来造这个房子，就造那个巴别塔画室了。但是也因为有这个房子呢，所以呢，也可以说是澳大利亚的中产阶级。
Having the Tower of Babel, which is the biggest wealth for any artist. For money, I'm not a rich man. I have spent all my earnings in the building of my studio, which housed the Tower of Babel. But owning the house, we should be classified as middle class in Australia. I'm sure you are, because in the housing crisis, probably be more than middle class. Thank you. My second question, can anyone approach you for a portrait, and how much do you charge?
Currently, now is Rochefort Gallery is 这个画廊是代理我的这个肖像业务，所以你去问那个任何人可以去问 Maggie， not me.
Currently, my portrait is being represented. Portrait painting is represented by Rochefort Gallery. So you can approach the owner, Maggie Wu, for painting a portrait. So by the way, the Rochefort Gallery is currently showing Shen Lao's solo exhibition. It's huge. It's mainly portrait. My next question is going back to history. When you first arrived in Australia in 1989, you were a very well-known artist in China. But you were in Australia sitting on a milk crate to draw portraits for tourists in Darling Harbour to make a basic living. How did you feel? Did you feel it was face losing?
No, 我没有任何感觉丢脸，因为在澳大利亚没有人歧视手艺人。我在那里每画完一张肖像，背后围观的人都会欢呼鼓掌。当然我在中国被认为是已经很有名的艺术家，但是我实际上是千千万万的这个知识青年的一员。在文革中间，我们在作为知识青年，我就是其中的一个零。那么到这儿来，当然也是要挣钱还债，所以从头开始。但对我来讲，这个很容易。
I didn't feel it was a losing face, because in Australia, people don't discriminate people with the skills. Actually, each time when I drew a portrait, people around us, they give us a round of applause. So when I came, I had nothing, but that wasn't new, because I grew up during the Cultural Revolution as an educated youth, ascending down to the countryside. As an educated youth, I had nothing, and I started from scratch. So I was used and trained to be starting from scratch. So when I first came, I just starting from scratch and paying back first the debt that I owned when I came. And I didn't feel anything shameful about that. So back then, what made you believe that one day you'd be a successful artist in Australia?
我到澳大利亚的第二天，我就去你说 Art Gallery 看了那个阿基包展览，我觉得我不比那些入围的艺术家差，所以我想我应该可以入围的。但是听说这个阿基包有一个小圈子，好像很难进去。可是呢，我没2年，我第2次入围送阿基包的就入围了，持续了很多年。而且在我到澳洲的第6年，我就得了那个Reimagined Art Award， 所以这也算一个成功吧。所以我觉得这里很公平。
The second day after I arrived in Sydney, I went to Archbold Prize Show. And when I saw those paintings, and I felt I wasn't secondary to any of the artists who were there as a finalist, I heard that entering Archboard was a very small circle. But the second time I tried, I became the finalist. So 6 years after my arrival in Sydney, I won a Mary MacLeod award and was received actually by Francis Pope. So that marked my success. Were you surprised by your achievements and fame, or do you think you should be more famous?
我可能是因为在中国很突然，就很早的20几岁的时候就因为一张画就出了名，所以我对这个成功啊、出名啊这些事情，我就从来不去想这些事儿。那么到了澳洲以后呢，我首先要想的是生存下来，怎么还债，然后家庭来了以后怎么养家，这些都一步一步的。但是呢，我有一个想法，就是说我应该首先做到。就是说用半年的时间挣出来我1年的所需要的钱能够生存，那么剩下来半年我就可以发展我的这个艺术，基本就是这么一步步过来啊。那么在那个对我来讲好像名声啊、成功啊这些都从来不在我的考虑里面，但是我很长时间困扰的，倒反而是另外一个问题，就是说怎么能够让我的审美理想跟所谓的这个当代艺术怎么能够跟他们能够融洽起来啊？这个我一直没有最后解决。
I didn't really care so much about success or fame. Perhaps I got the fame, and so famous when I was in my 20s in China. When I came, I more focused on make a living and pay off my debt and raise my family, support my family. I also wanted to spend half of the year to make enough living for a whole year, so I can use the other half of the year doing what I wanted to do, using my painting skills. So making a living or achieving success wasn't really my concern. What actually puzzled me for all these years is how to resolve the gap or the difference or a reconciliation between my artistic aesthetics with what is called contemporary art. So far, I'm still puzzled by my pursuit. My next question, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had stayed in China?
那我是想过，如果我留在中国的话，我那时候我来的同时，我已经是准备要调到浙江美术学院当教师所以呢，我就会一直在美术学院里面，叫做忆我昏昏，使人昏昏那么我肯定呢还会画很多拐弯抹角来表达我想法的画，比方说像兄弟戏一墙这样的画，我还肯定会画出来。但是呢，我肯定画不出来巴别塔这样的画。那么在某一个历史关头，我会被打入冷宫，这是肯定的。那么这是大概想如果说我还在那里画画，我肯定还画了很多宣传画，而且我肯定是会所谓的拿国务院津贴。我也是不知道国内很多我的朋友啊、老师啊，他们都有一条在个人履历上写着拿国务院的津贴，我到现在不知道这个津贴是多少钱然后呢我当然会在那里退休，然后出席数不清的开幕式，当然不是我自己的。只有一点是肯定的，我不会画堕落。
I love the last bit. If I had stayed in China, I would be, because back then I was asked to teach, so I would be teaching fine arts in Zhejiang Academy of Fine Arts. But I would be a dozy teacher and teaching students who fell asleep. I would still be a history painter, but I would found different ways, veiled ways to express myself. I would be able to still paint my big history painting called Brothers and Sisters, which was created in 2018. It was really featured 450 historical figures during 1936 and 1937, the period of Republic of China. So that painting I would probably be able to create, but I will not be able to create Tower of Babel, that's for sure. In a certain period, I would be probably banished or punished for not following the rules. I would, if I were allowed to paint, I would probably paint a lot of propaganda paintings. I think I would receive state council's allowances. I'm not sure what is it, but I see many of my friends who live in China, they always listed that receiving state council's allowances in their CV, and I don't even know how much is it. I would attend many exhibition openings, but they are not my exhibition. One thing for sure is I would never be a corrupt official in China. You have painted so many portraits, many, as I mentioned, in the Rochford gallery. Do you have a favorite portrait? And are some people's easier than others to paint? Do you have a preference?
Yeah, I have my favorite portrait is not in here, is in New Zealand. I did it for a New Zealand couple. Is Sir Roderick family. But the painting originally they want me to only painting the lady is Gillian lady Gillian. But finally I painted 3 dogs, and with Gillian's husband is teaching the dogs. This painting I love. I don't think everybody easier to painting portrait or someone else is not easier. For me also, of course I prefer to 我非常那个偏好画自己家人还有狗。
Yes, because one of his favorite painting was in New Zealand, and actually he meant to paint the hostess, but ended up painting their 3 dogs with the husband, giving the dogs a lesson. And he thinks that not necessarily some people are easier to paint than others. To him, they are all the same. But for preference, he prefers to paint his family members and dogs, and which you can see that actually he paints a lot of Wang Lan and their daughter. They're beautiful. So I really love that, and so prefer to paint their family. From talking about the Babel, from conceiving the idea to the completion, Tower of Babel is 20 years in the making, taking you so much of your time, effort, and finance. What is the drive behind this obsession?
我相信呢，真正有这个生命力的作品，一定是这个来自作者自身的生命感悟和这个体验。我呢是在中国，我来这里的时候是40岁，所以套用一句中国的俗话，就是说，我把40年的生命都贡献给了共产主义事业。那么作为艺术家的幸运的地方啊，如果是一个普通人的话，这种贡献变成一个0，完全是 nothing。对大量的跟我一起下乡的那些知青来讲，他们的生命体验也都是浪费。但是幸运的作为艺术家，就是他可以把这种体验、这种浪费的这种东西，给他转化成自己作品的本源。这个是我幸运的，所以我的作品其实就来自我自己的生命体验。那么当我有了这个巴别塔的这个突然有这个灵感的时候，我突然就意识到，这个就是我的这个应该怎么说呢？就用一个什么词呢？应该是宿命，是我的宿命。所以有了这个想法以后，我就要调动我所有的可能性来完成这些作品。
I believe all our artworks are coming from our life experiences and awakening. When I came to Australia, I was 40 years old. So I basically dedicated 40 years of my life to communist movement. Luckily, I was an artist. And like many other people who are not artists, and then, many of their lives were wasted because, during the Cultural Revolution and communist movement. But being an artist, I was able to turn my experiences into an endless source of inspiration. When I first had this epiphany of the Tower of Babel, I felt that was my destiny. So regardless, whatever it take, I must complete and must reach my destiny.
而且要赶紧画出来，在上帝没有发现我的画巴别塔之前，不然就完不成。
And I must be very hurry up because otherwise, when it is too late, I wouldn't be able to. And when God discovered what I was doing, He may stop me from doing it. My next question is, I found it remarkable and very touching that your wife, Wang Lan, and through this film, I get to know Wang Lan a lot. So your wife, Wang Lan, the fellow artist, and also your daughter are very supportive of your mad act, as John McDonald described. Have they ever complained?
对我的这个巴别塔这个项目，他们从来不 complain。王兰呢，就是有时候抱怨我生活的像一个阿 Q 住在土库寺里面啊，或者是抱怨我开车出去追了人家的尾要赔钱，都是这种事情。但是在这个事业上面，他们都非常支持我，因为我也是一步一步的按计划实行。
They actually were have been very supportive of my creation of a Tower of Babel. Wang Lan sometimes complained, said that I had RQ spirit. RQ spirit came from Chinese artist, a Chinese writer Lu Xun, meaning one tends to deceive oneself into believing that he's successful. That's very typical of Wang Lan. So, and also sometimes Wang Lan complained when I gate tailing and then run into other people's car, and then I had to pay. So I wasn't happy about that. But they never complained about my fantasies in artistic fantasies. That is also because for each act that I do, I fully prepared myself. Tower of Babel is like an encyclopedia of international communist movement, as we have seen. How could you get to know and remember those artworks and 400 individuals? And also, did any of those individuals come into your dreams?
如果说你跟一群人生活在一起，每天都生活在一起，很多年，那么你对这一群人每个人你都知道他们叫什么名字，他们的性格，他们的经历你都会知道。那么我这个比喻呢，就是说。我这张画里面的所有的艺术作品，或者这里画里面的那些生活在20世纪的，甚至我从来没见过他们，在我出生以前他们已经去世了。就这些人的，他们的故事，他们的事情，就是这一群人跟我一直在生活在那里，所以我对他们了如指掌。
你做过梦见人？
我当然，我好几次梦见过毛主席。
So it's like this. When you live with a group of people in your life, they appear in your life every single day, and you get to know their names, their appearances, their likings, so you know them very well. So it's like this. When I painted the Tower of Babel, I basically lived with all these 400 people. So that's how I get to know them. I know them really well. Yes, I actually dreamed someone several times, which is Chairman Mao. Last question. What would you like viewers to take away with them from seeing this epic work? Are you concerned that some people may not get the significance of this epic work?
当然是我想随着这个时光的流逝，这个能够理解这件作品的人会越来越少。因为现在我们很多人是因为是通过经历他才会有那个，但是我相信呢，艺术作品它本身的这个这种感染力，它是超越这个历史知识的那个尝试的。在我这个画室里面，我接待过上千个访问的人，他们中间很少有人对这个历史有比较深入的理解，但是首先他们会感到非常震撼，然后很感动，甚至有的人一边看还掉眼泪啊。那么我就想，这就好像我们今天的人，我们读了《三国演义》，那我们就去查《三国志》是怎么写的，是吧？或者说我们有人看了，我们如果看了列宾的一件作品叫《查布洛斯人写信给土耳其苏丹》，然后你看了以后就很感动，又非常喜欢，但是回去你才去查这个乌克兰的这个哥萨克怎么回事，所以这个是艺术，就是这样的一种。
Well, I think with the time passing, a few people would know about history. But I think art often, people's understanding of art also often takes precedence of their historical knowledge. People who visited my studio, because Shen Jiawei's artwork is on 4 walls of his studio, and the studio is huge. And so I have received over 1,000 visitors to my studio looking at the paintings of the Tower of Babel. Many people had very little knowledge of history, but they were either shocked by the scale of it, or they were very surprised. And some actually were very touched, and a few people I actually saw they were crying. So it's like this, they often look at something and then they don't understand, but they go and then search. For example, when you read the historical novel, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and that would lead you to read more about the history of the Three Kingdoms. So it's a kind of a similar thing, like people who saw the painting of reply of Zaporozhian Cossacks to Turkish Sultan by Ilya Repin. And then they may actually go and search the history of Ukraine. So it's actually art probably prompts you to know more about history. I have asked Nancy to give you a question. So, and then equally ask Shen Jiawei to give Nancy a question. This is Nancy's question. After completing a monumental project like Tower of Babel, which you worked on for so long, decades, do you feel a sense of a relief and some uncertainty about what comes next? Do you ever feel a pressure to top what you did before?
是啊，我完成了，我很庆幸，就是趁着上帝打瞌睡的时候，我把它完成了。他一醒过来，发现已经完成，也没法阻止了啊。但是这件作品，我现在不为任何那个，因为我已经年纪很大，我可以再画些很多我计划里的画。要超越呢，我想这个巴别塔太高了，已经到了天堂里，我再也超越不了它了。
I'm very fortunate and I feel very pleased, after before actually God wake up from his nap, I've already completed the Tower of Babel. So it's too late to stop me. And at my age, I don't plan to do many more things, but I do have a few things that I want to paint. And as for surpassing Tower of Babel, I think the tower has already gone into the sky, so there is no way to surpass it. Let's thank Shen Jiawei for the wonderful answers. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So now I'm sure you've had enough time to prepare yourself while listening to Shen Jiawei. So my questions are different from Shen Jiawei. Nancy, you are now successfully emerged artist. When you finally decided to be a full-time artist, did you have a plan B? If yes, what was it? If not, what made you so confident that you could make it?
I just say I went with plan B first because I was too scared to pursue plan A. Right after I graduated, I did a lot of jobs outside of the arts, even though I was already interning at a glass studio. So I had the opportunity, unlike a lot of my peers who weren't as lucky to have an internship at a glass studio where you could make your own work, to make your work. But for some reason, actually, I know the exact reason, is that there's a sense of insecurity of, how do I make a living from this, from making art? How do I do this? How do I do that? So I pursued plan B instead. But after a few months of working in plan B, I realized, what's the point of life? I went through a bit of an existential crisis, and I really thought about my purpose and what I wanted to do. And that's when I decided I had enough savings to at least work in art for a year and see how I go. And if I had no talent and there was nothing for all the hard work I put in, then I'll give it up. But as you can see, I'm still here.
That's wonderful. That's really good. Of all art mediums, why did you choose glass, which to me is not only less known, hence harder to succeed, but also very difficult to master, and also so expensive?
Yeah, when you start in glass, you don't know these things. I think I attribute it to naivete. I guess it was the arrogance of youth when you look at something and you're like, how hard could it be? Apparently very hard. So I started off in painting, but I've always been drawn to glass as a material, and I had imagined making glass sculptures before I actually knew how they were made. So when I got the first chance to study glass at SCA, that's when I was able to pursue it, and I realized it was very, very hard. But by then it was already too late. I was already addicted to the material, and I found, like Louise so beautifully said in her speech, that it reflected so much of who I see myself, my personality, my spirit, its strength and vulnerability that coexist in one kind of medium and object, and the psychological aspects of glass is what really makes me stay.
I'm sure glass has chosen you. So, growing up as an Australian Chinese kid, were you made conscious of your different appearance? And did you ever wish you were not Chinese looking? Or your Chinese heritage made no negative difference to you?
I think when I was growing up, and I live in a predominantly Greek-dominated suburb where in my primary school there were only 2 Asians when I was in kindergarten, other than me. Maybe there was 2 only, including me. And I found that obviously you kind of notice that people look different. But I don't think I was so much influenced by the aesthetics of wanting to have blonde hair. Maybe I did at one point. But it was more of a case where I really started noticing the upbringing was different. For example, and I think these are things that you notice as a kid, is that a lot of Asian kids really did not like holidays, because that meant workbooks. And we really enjoyed coming back to school. So those are the kind of like nuanced aspects that makes you kind of compare your upbringing with those around you. And there's where you see where the tension or intersection of 2 cultures start. And I think it's kind of beautiful that it's in a country that is multicultural. So you don't have too much domination of one culture, and you can kind of look at both and have perspectives from both.
Very interesting, very interesting. My next question is, you obviously look into your Chinese heritage and some of your works when inspired by your interest in particularly Chinese historical novel, Romance of the 3 Kingdoms. In the meantime, you also use this their interest to question the burden of Chinese heritage. For example, the images of Zhang Fei and Guan Yu in your glass armor. How do you tackle and manage this contradiction?
I think there's a very important role that myths play in society in that they kind of reflect the values of a specific culture, and they show that what we hold dear. So, but I also feel like myths are living things that, because they're constantly reinterpreted by people. And with the world becoming more changed and globalized, you see that in traditional Chinese myths or cartoons that are revisiting those traditional myths, and they've completely changed the stories. For a recent cartoon like Nurture completely changed the story of how the actual myth went. But then when you think about it, first you might feel a bit you feel like it's not doing the original story justice. But once you actually think about it, or once I actually thought about it, it actually made sense, because it was interpreting the myth to suit a contemporary audience, where our values have changed, where the world has changed. So I think there's and I'm sure it has happened over the years for all types of myths. But also I think the value of looking into history, and especially myths that are describing possibly real events, but I'll bet more grandiose than they probably were, is that there is an enduring nature, like human nature aspect to it, where we can still relate to those themes of pride. We can still relate to those themes of and put ourselves in the shoes of these possibly ruthless, but also possibly vulnerable people.
Indeed. I feel the way that you reinterpreted Chinese history actually expand our, including myself, understanding of the Chinese history. Putting your work in the kiln and waiting for the final product must be very taxing and a nerve-wracking process. What do you do to ease your anxiety and to steady your nerves?
I think practice, it's just exposure therapy. I will say the first couple of times where things have failed, I would step away from it for a really long time. Like I can't go back to glass. It's too hard. But afterwards, but you always kind of come back. Like there would be a time where I would be pretty much guarding the kiln once I put the piece in for 24 hours up to the top temperature, where I would just keep myself awake the entire night. But now I think because like things break, glass breaks, and when you're trying to figure out a certain material, you're going to have a lot of failures. So it's really a case of picking yourself back up. And I think glass kind of has that sense of, that instills that sense of resilience in you, because you wouldn't be able to make much out of it if you kind of, well, you can sob after after a really big project broke, but I kind of remember when I did. But nowadays when I see glass hasn't turned out or it's broken, when I put in hours of work, everyone around me is really shocked, and I have this one moment in my head where I fast forward or backtrack to all the work I put in, and then I just go, okay, start again. And that's how it is.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, it's much better than meditation, so I would try to learn this skill. So do you think being a glass sculptor has toughened you up, both physically and mentally? When was the last time you cried over a failed sculpture?
Yeah, I preluded to that. I can't remember the last time I cried, but I remember the first time I cried. I was in I think third year of my bachelor's degree at SCA, and I was working on my major project, and I had 2 fails come out of the kiln where the kiln was completely flooded in glass. And this was a couple of weeks before the graduation exhibition. So I was like, I can't really do much at that point. So I went into the head kind of teacher's office, head professor's office, to tell them about my situation. And as I was halfway through talking about it, I suddenly burst into tears. I had been holding it in at that point, and then he was very, well, I mean, what can you say at that point with a sobbing student in front of you? So, but since then, I haven't had, I would say, as hard of a breakdown as that point from the making of it, because you kind of start to realize this is what it's about. It's about when you, and I'm sure with Shen Jiawei as well, when he's trying to do his paintings and perfecting, he's gone to the point of mastery. But before he got to that point of mastery, there's so many points where you're scratching your head over, how do I get this effect? How do I make this work? How can I make this a successful piece? And it's really the same, I think, in glass, but it just feels more visceral with broken glass in front of you.
I think the painting's easier. It's just a repaint. Well, now you are studying in US, because I did my 3 degrees in English literature. It's mainly, primarily to shirk responsibilities. I didn't want to work. I didn't want to have a boss. And also I just enjoyed reading novels. So why are you studying? And what are you studying in US? And what US has that we don't have?
Yeah, I'm currently studying for my master's in fine arts in the Southern Illinois University, where I'm studying under Jiawei, who's a very famous glass artist, and which is why the reason I went over. I think they have a very thriving glass program there, in terms of in US in general. Though after having seen quite a bit of the glass artworks there, I feel like Australia's not doing too bad. I think there's a lot of differences in terms of the glass in America and the glass in Australia, where I feel like, I don't know if you want to hear too much about this, but the glass in Australia has a lot more, I guess, art for art's sake. And in America, there's a lot more of a commercial push in my mind. So it's kind of interesting to find that, to be brought into a different world and different pace as well.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Relating to that, now you are living and studying in another country. Does it make you look at Australia and look at your own practice in Australia differently?
It definitely does. So I was talking about my professor Jiawei, who's a very, very wonderful artist, and his work, to give you a bit of insight into his mindset as well, is that he is an absolute perfectionist. His work is minimalistic and it has to capture people's attention. And I've never seen myself as a perfectionist. I think half of my work, a lot of it is drawn from the conceptual side. So after working with him, it really brought another kind of perspective for me when I look at my work in terms of things I could perfect and things I could do better. So it's kind of exciting to know that I still have a long way to go as an artist.
Okay. Apart from determination and drive as an artist, what is the joy, or what are the joys that have kept you going?
I think that's really hard. I think definitely my family and friends and my wonderful partner over there. I think without their support, it would be very, very difficult to stay in the arts, because it is such a punishing arena. And I say arena because it feels like you're battling both your work, both all the obstacles in your way as an artist. So there's so much joy in being an artist, in making the work that you want to make and exploring the concepts you want to explore and having those intimate conversations and connections with friends who might have originally started as audiences to your work. But I think you can't deny the reality that it's very, very difficult.
My last question, what is your ultimate goal? To be famous and rich?
It would be nice. I think ultimately what at least I think any artist wants for their work is to connect or connect meaningfully to an audience, to move them in some way. And I think that's probably what brings me the most impact, is knowing that my work is something that I'm proud of and something that touches others.
The last question is from Shen Jiawei, and this question, and I feel like he still holds grudges. So this is a way back, and you were in China and in Beijing, and enrolled in the Central Academy of Fine Art, China. And then you decided not to pursue, and instead you came back to Australia to do your study of fine arts. What was the reason behind the decision?
Yeah, sorry about that. Well, I did study 1 year in Central Academy of Fine Arts, and I found the environment was one that was, for me, it kind of felt like it was crushing the creativity out of me, where because of how it's structured, every painting and sketch, which is generally for model in front of you, is marked out of 100. And those scores are publicized on a notice board. And then at the end of the year, they call you up by your rank, and then you get to choose your department. So if you want to get into some of the more popular departments like painting or sculpture, you have to rank in at least the top 60 or 70 just to ensure you get in. And I did get into the department I want, which is sculpture. But by then, what the experience left me really changed. Like, my peers were amazing, but what I found was, because everything was marked and those marks actually had a real consequence to your future, it made me at least very much risk adverse. So for example, it could be the simplest thing, like everyone's drawing on an A1 piece of paper. If I want to do an A2 for some reason, I'm like, what if it affects my mark? So I feel like pressured to always follow what the crowd was. You didn't want to be the tall poppy or the nail sticking out. And that for me was the biggest thing that made me really want to. And once I found out that SEA had glass, that was like, okay.
Now, are you happy? I mean, this is a wonderful answer, and just really get us to know you, and also Chinese system. And we grew up there, and we got used to it. And I was thinking when I was listening to you, perhaps after you've done your glass, you would be able to accept if they publish anything. But anyway, so it's also because of competition, just a huge population in China. So they have to find a way to select people. Please give a round of applause. Thank you so much, Nancy. It's wonderful. And I'm sure that you do feel like I feel that I know Nancy a lot more, and I know Shen Laoshi a lot more. So that's really the end of this event.